In this lesson, we're going to learn about the different roles and services that the different members of society in both the North and South would take part in. Now, we know the social strata of the South, which, of course, before the war, slaves were at the bottom. But who was at the top? Who was the most wealthy and powerful in the South? Yes, plantation owners. Then the various classes, as they went down, would be those who owned a few slaves, and eventually some that owned land, and then you had the more common class of more poor people. We're going to look at where each of these groups fell as far as service in the war. Now, the first group we're going to look at are the plantation owners. And the plantation owners, there were some interesting characteristics of their service. So I have a fictional scenario here at a plantation where we're going to use our usual characters, the plantation owner, who I have adequately named, I'm sure you know, Mr. Headright, and his wife, who I've adequately named Mrs. Headright, and they're having a conversation about the war. And this conversation about the war would go something like this. I'm going to use my Southern woman voice. Hey, honey, are you going to go fight in that ghastly war so we Southerners can keep our, what did they refer to slavery as? Especially because they cared for their slaves, unlike the Northern factory workers, except that was probably a lie, but that was their argument. Yes, positive good. And then they also refer to slavery as the peculiar institution. So, I'm going to re-bring back those terms in this fictional discourse between a plantation owner and his wife, who we name Mr. Headright. Mr. Headright, the master, the plantation owner, probably responded, well, honey, I don't have to. Now, the reason that he did not have to was because he was one of the more wealthy people in the South, and he owned more than 20 slaves. And the legislatures in the South passed a law called the 20 Slave Law that excluded from service anyone with 20 slaves or more. Of course, these would be millionaires in today's money. So he was excluded and said, well, honey, I don't have to because I have more than 20 slaves. So I am exempt under the 20 Slave Law. Now, some Southern plantation owners, though, would join, and they would automatically be put in charge of troops because of their social position. So he is pondering this and says, but I may still serve as an officer because some of these wealthy plantation owners chose to serve as officers. And he likes the sound of a Colonel Headright. Of course, this would be a pretty high-ranking officer. So he says, Colonel Headright, I like the sound of that. So basically, the point of the lesson is that some wealthy Southerners with more than 20 slaves were exempt from service under the 20 Slave Law, but some chose to serve as officers. So let's look at this slide here. Before the war, as we well know, cash crops and slave labor brought wealth, and those with the most slaves were the most wealthy. This brought social and political status. And the South defended slavery and the Southern way of life. During the war, some Southerners were exempt or excused under the 20 slave law, but some also volunteered and served as officers in the Confederate Army. So plantation owners either chose to remain out of the war, as they were allowed to under the 20 slave law, or they entered and immediately were moved to the rank of officer due to their social position of being an elite plantation owner. Here's a Confederate officer, which many of the plantation owners would choose to be. The next social class that we are going to discuss were the lower classes. These would be the more numerous small farmers or workers on farms that owned maybe a little land, but perhaps none at all. The lower classes in the Civil War served and died in disproportionate numbers to the elite. In other words, this war, most of the soldiers that fought and died were the poor on both sides. So here I'm going to create a fictional scenario between a farmer and a other type of laborer in the South. Someone maybe digging a shovel here. And they may have been drafted and they're having their conversation. Here we go, off to fight these rich plantation owners' war. Many in the South felt that it was for the rich plantation owners. Remember, they were the ones that had the most support for the war, because if slavery ended, they had the most to lose. So, and the lower classes were the ones that were making up the general population of the soldiers. And he's going, yeah, they being exempt under the 20 slave law. And then they go on to make the point. It says, I'll tell you, poor people in the North do their fighting too. And that's true. The ones that were mostly drafted were the poor, including the recent immigrants. As I've told you before, the immigrants were getting off the ship from Europe that they traveled over, and they were immediately signing up, of course, at the encouragement of recruitment officers for the Army, and they would be drafted into the Union Army. This was one of the major advantages of the North, of course, a steady supply of new soldiers. Let's look at this part of the PowerPoint. So, Union soldiers, they were the poor. Many were from the cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. They were the factory workers. They were the lower class. Many were recent immigrants that had just got to the country. The Confederate soldiers, many were the poor. They had grown up on farms or in rural areas. They had experience with guns but little military training. Both sides experienced very unhappy conditions. In the camps, diseases spread rapidly. Here's a picture of the camp. We'll get that. Both sides experienced devastation because, I mean, over 1 million people died in this war. I mean, I need to look up the number. I forget. I know it's in excess of 1 million. It may be much higher than that. Now, some of the things that soldiers experienced in the camp were disease. You can see when you have people this close and it's hard to practice proper hygiene, disease spreads. They're tired, long marches, sick. That goes along with disease in some ways. hungry. As we know, especially the Confederates, they had very little supplies. And part of that was because the railroads were getting destroyed by the North and you couldn't transport it. Another part was just because the South couldn't produce enough for the civilians and the military, which would use more food because it's a activity that would burn calories and cause a greater need for food. Scared, fighting in the war would be awful, that's understand. The conditions in the camp where it rained all the time, it's not fun to be wet by the rain, lonely, but they fought valiantly on both sides. Now, after the war, to experience the devastation and the effects of the war, I'm going to use this scenario where the plantation owner returns home, and we will draw him coming home to his wife after the war, and she says, "Hi, honey," and he gallops in on his horse, lucky enough to continue to have the horse and his life. Let's give him a little bit longer legs, make him a more powerful steed. And here's Colonel Headright. He's back. And he's happy to see his wife. Says, "Hi, honey. Colonel Headright is back." And she greets her husband, except he's looking around. And it shouldn't be a surprise, but he looks at his nice plantation, and there's a big hole in the side where a cannonball hit it. Here, porch is falling off. And he looks around, and he goes, well, what happened? What happened to the plantation? It shouldn't be a surprise, but of course, destruction happened. War brings destruction, and it brought destruction to many of these plantation owners' houses. Even the slave quarters were banged up. And then he looks around and he sees probably the most disconcerting thing after his wife says, "Why, honey, it was destroyed by the war." Maybe Sherman came through and did this. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. Then he looks and he sees his dollar bills walking off the plantation. Now, of course, I'm using this just to emphasize the money that he saw walking off the plantation was his slaves. Of course, this was the greatest economic investment in the South. Of course, the slaves are so happy. Slaves no more, free at last. But to the Southern plantation owners, they see their money walking off the plantation. He says, "Why are my slaves leaving?" He says, "They're my property and my money." And she says, "Not anymore. Slavery's over. The Union Army came and freed them." So, he says, "Yeah, I heard something about the Emancipation Proclamation, but we never listened to it." She's like, "Yeah, I never listened to it either, like you told me. But I had to free them because the Army come here and made me." So, he says, "Oh, well, life's about over." But he said, "Oh, we do have a big old pile of Confederate money." "What about that pile of Confederate money there?" She said, "It's worthless. Why is Confederate money valuable when there is no more Confederacy?" So, these are some of the things that the plantation owners experienced after the war. was economic ruin, the loss of their house, and of course the loss of their slaves. All of this adds up to they're flat broke. So, and if things would go as planned, they'd also lose their land. However, they never, as we'll come to that in future lessons. So, now this brings us over to the farmers' houses, where, let's just say they're in earshot, and the farmer lady says, "Oh, I hear you over there on your plantation whining about the loss of your slaves and the house broken down, but you're lucky because you have your husband. Mine is gone. My husband is gone." And when you lose your husband, you are known as something that starts with a W. Does anybody know? Yes, a widow. She says, "And now I have to care for all the children myself." So, she of course cries because the loss of her husband brings great devastation. And there were many Southern women that were widowed, which means they lost their husband. She said, "And before this, we had it bad too. We had it hard because our soldiers needed food and clothes. And when the stockpiles ran out, guess where they got them? They came and took ours, food and clothes, and we had to do without or find substitutes." So, and that's true. I've seen several movies where they leave these Confederate soldiers behind, and they're usually like the sons of wealthy plantation owners who they don't want to send to war, and their job is to go around and take and gather goods from the poor people so they could send them off to war. Then, she said, "I did have a little bit of Confederate money, but inflation, which is when the price of things goes so high that money becomes worthless, as happened in the Great Depression. It was more sensible to burn money than it was to save it, because it was better as firewood. Inflation, such as 20,000 Confederate dollars for a loaf of bread, has made our money worthless." And then she says, "Oh, and by the way, the farmer across the way, she's not a widow, but her husband isn't quite the man he was, so quit your whining over here. Her husband came back as an amputee, missing limbs. So now she has to make up for him not being the man he was. So here's an amputee. Let's pretend he lost a leg." So these were some of the problems that were experienced after the war. For the poorer people, many women were widowed or left with husbands that were amputees. Any Confederate money was worthless, a thing that was felt on both sides of the spectrum. And during the war, they had to find substitutes because a lot of their things were being taken or commandeered by the Confederate Army because the Confederate Army was so low on supplies. So here's a picture of some Confederate women. Women were left behind to run the farms and plantations, just as in the Revolution. Their lives were made difficult due to a shortage of clothes and food, and they had to find substitutes or went without. Inflation made Confederate money worthless. As in the Revolution, some women were nurses or raised money for the war. Many were forced to flee their homes as the Union Army advanced. And at the end, many were left widowed and forced to be the sole providers for the family. To end the lesson, here is some Confederate money. I'll bet you recognize this gentleman right here. Who is he? Boerhaave nullification, states' rights would be 3 key things to remember him by. Yes, that is John C. Calhoun on the Confederate dollar. I don't know who these others are. To show that the Confederate money was worthless, many you encounter today has these holes that were punched in it, pretty much showing the South that there is no Confederacy anymore and your Confederate money is worthless. In the next lesson, we are going to learn more about service in the war, the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation, and children's role in the war. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.